This is a story of who we were, how we got here.
Houston, the Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility.
And where we are going.
You've got mail.
So join us as we take history off the page.
Then at last came a damp, cold night in Flanders, through which we marched silently. And when the day began to emerge from the fog, suddenly an iron salute came whizzing over our heads towards us, and with a sharp report, the small bullets struck between our rows, whipping up the wet earth. But before the small cloud had disappeared, out of 200 throats, the first hurrah roared a welcome to the first messenger of death. But then it began to crackle and roar, to sing and howl, and with feverish eyes each one of us was drawn forward, faster and faster, over the turnip fields and hedges, till suddenly fight began, the fight of man against man. But from the distance, the sounds of a song met our ears, coming nearer and nearer, passing from company to company. And then, while Death busily plunged his hand into our rows, the song also reached us, and now we passed it on. Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles in der Welt. After 4 days, we came back. Even our step had become different. Boys of 17 now resembled men. The volunteers of the regiment had perhaps not yet learned to fight properly, but they knew how to die like old soldiers. This was the beginning. Adolf Hitler, Mein Kampf. There are many places one could start a history of Nazi Germany. As we'll talk about in more detail next time, over the years, scholars have expressed a wide range of opinions on this matter. Some focus on Germany's distant past, connecting the rise of the Nazis to Martin Luther, the Reformation, Prussian militarism, or even the long history of anti-Semitism in Europe. The great Cambridge historian Richard Evans begins his massive 3-volume series on the topic with Bismarck and the German Empire. Still others trace the genesis of the Nazis to the Weimar Republic, focusing on the failure of the state, its failure to nurture a democratic culture, the consequences of the Versailles Treaty, or the pressures of the Great Depression. All of these are, of course, perfectly valid historical opinions and interpretations. But we'll begin our exploration of Nazi history with the First World War, an event of seismic proportions that radically altered many Germans' feelings about the nature of politics, the legitimacy of the idea of using violence, and the relationship between the two. The Great War redefined many Germans' notions of community, separating in their minds the connection between the citizens of the German state, die Bevölkerung in German, and those who were seen as legitimate members of the national community, das Volk. This is a much more ethnic reading or kind of language that people use when they talk about German belonging as an ethnicity, as opposed to the modern idea of citizenship. In many ways, one could argue the brutality of the war and the persistence of violence in its immediate aftermath led to a new form of politics, one that was radically different, theoretically uncorrupted by the failure of the lost war. And we could add one that led directly to National Socialism. Of course, this new politics was deeply affected by the war, especially in terms of its understandings of morality. In place of centuries of Judeo-Christian and Enlightenment-based ethics predicated on notions of empathy and tolerance, the radical Nazi and communist alternatives that were birthed by the Weimar Republic emphasized the dehumanization of one's enemies. Not just the foreign French and British, but especially the internal enemies, the Jews, the Catholics, the socialists. These are the categories that the fascists mostly objected to. If you were a communist, you would say the enemy was big business or the bourgeoisie, that they had to be eliminated or dealt with. But whatever side you were on, one can basically argue that across the culture, the idea of empathy was transformed from being a virtue, as many of us, hopefully living in a democratic society, would see it, into something that was a vice, a weakness. How could you care about or even think about or try to understand the positions of people that are different from you? This was a great gulf that the war opened up in German society. You can, of course, find these arguments in many places, but they pervade, above all else, the pages of Mein Kampf. And the passage that I read at the start of our podcast from Mein Kampf well illustrates some of these themes, especially the notion that the experience of combat changed consciousness. There's some interesting parallels here if you think about the way that communists or Marxists approach the idea of class and this notion that class conflict, exploitation by the bourgeoisie, these are things that create a new consciousness in the minds of workers, a new understanding of their identity. One could argue that some Germans saw the experience of combat in the same way, for reasons that we'll talk about in our podcast today. Continuing, there is this idea that the violence of the Great War reforged the German soldier, reworking his understandings of things like loyalty, sacrifice, and duty. Later in the passage that I read to you, Hitler also points out how it changed notions of masculinity. As Hitler wrote, "Out of the veil of the past, the iron front of the gray steel helmet," he noted, became, quote, "visible, not wavering and not retreating, a monument to immortality," end quote. War gave Germans like Hitler the illusion of power and strength, of control over events in an increasingly chaotic and turbulent world. And so however delusional the idea was, for Hitler and for many of his fellow German travelers, this idea of violence as a solution to political problems became the foundation for a new political movement in the early 1920s. How and why this happened will be the subject of today's podcast. Now, before we get into the history as a whole, I just want to note that this is the first in what should be about a dozen episodes on the topic of Nazi Germany. For an overview of the full series, or to see a list of reading recommendations, please check out my website, www.historyoffthepage.com. Our Patreon supporters can also get access to some additional content, including our special episode on the young Hitler, which should be posted by the end of April. Okay, I don't want to spend a whole lot of time going over the military history of the war. Those of you that have listened to the podcast know that I have 2 episodes where I get into who fought what battle when, the alliance system, right, the causes of the war, all that stuff. But I want to talk today more about how the war was experienced by ordinary Germans and the ways in which the disappointment of defeat in 1918 left some Germans searching for something more radical, left them sort of in a mindset of, everything is not working, I'm fearful about the future, the old ways of doing things have failed us, it's time to burn everything down and start something that is radically different. Now, the first thing to note here is that as German society entered the war, it was incredibly confident in its ability to achieve a quick and decisive victory. Now, in some respects, this isn't really that surprising. If you look at the military history of the German Empire, it is one full of success, and indeed the path towards bringing the empire into being is one built on military success. First in 1864, the combined Prussian and Austrian armies defeated Denmark. Then in 1866, the Prussians beat Austria-Hungary and kind of excluded it from the future Germany that was forming. They built something called the North German Confederation. And then, of course, in 1870, they have the massive victory over the French at the Battle of Sedan. And this leads to the foundation of the German Empire. From this initial basis of military glory and military success, the young German state continued to advance and to gain more and more power. By the 1890s, the growing power of a fully industrialized economy enabled the German Empire to compete globally with the world's leading power of Great Britain. This push towards becoming a quote-unquote world power or Weltmacht in German, this contributed to a simultaneous push for colonies after 1884. Basically, in the late 19th century, many people looked at colonies as being a sign of being a great power, of being a significant player in sort of world politics. And so for prestige reasons, in addition to a little bit economic reasons, the German Empire pushed forward with colonization. Now, the German experience with colonization was somewhat of a mixed bag. In the 3 decades before the outbreak of war with Germany, they managed to seize a number of overseas territories. Today, you would recognize them as Tanzania, Togo, Cameroon, modern-day Namibia, for example. But none of these territories was particularly profitable. There's no equivalent, for example, to the British being in India, let alone someplace like Egypt or other places, obviously, where empires were involved. Today, many historians kind of judge this push for colonies as being a kind of massive mistake, as being something that antagonized the British, and that is indeed one of the causes of World War I, or at least one of the factors that brought the British directly into World War I. At any rate, as the continent lurched towards war in the late summer of 1914, this history of military success and rising economic and political power fueled expectations in Germany of a quick, decisive, and glorious victory. Even before the assassination of Franz Ferdinand in June 1914, right? Even before the big events that kind of are the spark that sets Europe on fire, if you will. There were right-wing political organizations such as the Pan-German League who dreamed of future annexations. The idea was to bring ethnic German communities in places like Eastern and Central Europe into an enlarged Reich. They also, by the way, thought about bringing the Dutch or the Swiss and sometimes even the Danes into this vision of an expanded Reich. But these fantasies of expansion made their way deep into the Kaiser's government. In particular, there's a very famous, although controversial, German historian named Fritz Fischer, who wrote in the 1960s about the ways in which German military war aims in World War I actually paralleled some of those from World War II. And so again, we see that this roots of Nazi foreign policy, the idea of conquest, it doesn't begin with Nazism itself, but it could be traced back to even before World War I. Now, when the war did come, at the start of August 1914, many Germans celebrated with what one might call the euphoria of expectant victory. You can see this in a number of places. There are big demonstrations, kind of parades, rallies that happen in big cities. People will hang out around the telegraph office, like waiting for the latest news. But to my mind, one of the clearest examples that illustrates this point is if you go online, you can see images of German soldiers that are about to be shipped to the front in rail cars, and they've taken chalk and they've written things like free vacation to Paris on the side of it. And that word vacation is their word that they use, right? Ausflug. This is going to be an excursion. This is going to be fun. This is going to be exciting. We're going to get to see the Eiffel Tower, not just to see it, but as conquerors. Reservists, if you read some of the writings, worried more about, am I going to get into the war? Is it all going to be over before I have a chance to become a hero, rather than thinking about what probably most of us would today? Am I going to get killed? Right? If I said, I've invented a time machine, I'm sending you back in time, you're going to be a soldier on the front lines in 1914. Your first thought is probably not about military glory. Your first thought is going to be about, am I going to get shot? Am I going to get killed by an artillery shell? Looking back on things several years later in 1925, Hitler would describe the moment of war in 1914 by saying that, quote, "To me personally, those hours appeared like the redemption from the annoying moods of my youth. Therefore, I am not ashamed today to say that, overwhelmed by impassionate enthusiasm, I had fallen on my knees and thanked heaven out of my overflowing heart that it had granted me the good fortune of being allowed to live in these times." End quote. Now, of course, he's writing this, again, after the fact. He's writing this as he's an aspiring politician. Mein Kampf is always really, really dangerous to kind of take the autobiography or the autobiographical section of it seriously, because as any politician, right, he's writing this with an audience. He's not trying to reflect on the truth of things. He's trying to send a message for a future political campaign. But from what we can tell, Hitler's enthusiasm about the war was most likely genuine. After the war was over, as Hitler was a politician but not yet dictator, there's a famous story of a photographer named Heinrich Hoffmann. And he took a picture of the Odeonsplatz when they're reading out the declaration of war in August of 1914. And so later on, he goes and discovers Hitler in the crowd, and then he shows it to Hitler, and Hitler's obviously very impressed by it. In addition to that, and if you look at the picture, Hitler is smiling, he looks very happy. But in addition to that, we know that Hitler was excited about the war because 3 days after its declaration, he volunteered to join the Bavarian army, where he served for all 4 years and won 2 Iron Crosses. Now, again, I don't want to spend too much time recounting the various battles and technological developments of World War I here. What matters more for our story is the ways in which this initial wave of euphoria broke upon the actual experience of war. As I'm sure you know, the First World War was not quick and glorious. But on the Western Front, a bloody stalemate that claimed the lives of approximately 2 million young German men. Another 4 million Germans would be wounded. And not only are the raw numbers kind of difficult to process, but the experience of combat was often brutal and difficult. Physically, fighting on the Western Front meant the construction and maintenance of parallel lines of trenches that covered about 475 miles, all the way from the mountains in Switzerland to the beaches of the English Channel. The areas in between the two, often referred to as being no man's land, were separated by barbed wire and other obstacles. You also had these kind of large craters that were created by the impact of modern artillery shells. If you ever have a chance to visit northern France, you go to Belgium along the front lines, you'll see all these kind of shell craters are still there. Right? A century has passed, and yet the landscape is largely the same because they were so big, because it was so devastating. In order to attack the enemy, soldiers from all of the sides, but in our case we're particularly concerned about German soldiers, when they went to fight, they had to go over the top. They had to expose themselves to machine gun fire, to snipers, to grenades from the enemy lines. The most deadly aspect of World War I was probably the artillery shell, which wasn't just a problem in that, okay, people are shooting shells at you, but it was psychologically difficult because it could strike at any moment at any place. If you're on the front line, if you're in the middle of a battle, okay, you're aware of what's going on, you can prepare yourself, you can try to cover, you can go into a bunker. But artillery shells can really fall anywhere. They can fall behind the lines while you're relaxing, can hit you at chow time. As the war dragged on and the trench system became more complex, soldiers spent considerable amounts of time in these dugout bunkers to try to protect them, which was great in terms of protection, but there was little natural light or air inside the bunker. These trenches, as you might expect, were often very dirty and wet. If I dig a big hole in the ground, what happens over time? It will fill up with water. Soldiers were also exposed to the elements. Think about being in Germany or northern France in the wintertime. It's going to be cold. They don't have modern jackets. They don't have the little, hot packets that you kind of break them up and then, oh, okay, it's warm, put inside my mittens or something. In the summertime, it's going to be hot. You're going to be wearing a gas mask and all that helmets and protection and clothing. There's no air conditioner in the First World War. You can't just go, oh, it's hot, I'm going to go inside, I don't feel like it. The combination of it being wet, along with obviously a lot of dead bodies, means that you're going to have a lot of animal life on the battlefield itself. We're talking about rats, and flies and lice and mosquitoes. They feed off both the living and the dead. You not only have the animals that are there that are attracted to the dead bodies, but what is attracting them? Of course, it's the smell. The battlefield reeks of death. And even when it doesn't, the dominant smell is chloride of lime. Chloride of lime is used to cover up the smell of dead bodies. Kind of like sometimes if you go into a nursing home or a hospital, right, you get that very strong smell of like the cleaning agents that they use. This is an omnipresent reminder on the battlefield of the massive loss of human life that is ongoing. Moreover, in these unsanitary conditions, diseases like trench foot, dysentery, typhoid fever, these are a constant threat. And oh, by the way, just for a little more fun, in 1918, we'll add a little Spanish flu on top of it. Now, despite all the things that I've just described, and all of them are pretty horrific, all of them we would notice pretty instantaneously, the number one thing soldiers actually complain about is not the death, is not the smell, is not the unsanitary conditions. It's actually boredom. Because unless you're in the middle of a battle, there's an awful lot of just sitting around. You have to be vigilant. You have to be ready to fight. You can't let down your guard, except nothing's actually going on. Psychologically, of course, World War I was also very difficult. There are a variety of ways that we could describe this, but to my mind, one of the clearest illustrations of the strain of combat comes from World War I veterans, and especially a particular scene from the writer Erich Remarque, who wrote a novel called All Quiet on the Western Front. All Quiet on the Western Front is, of course, one of the most known or best known pieces of literature that emerges from World War I. It is one of the sort of best arguments, if you will, for pacifism after World War I is over. If you're not familiar with the book, or now there's 3 versions of the movie that they've come out with, if you're not familiar with it, it basically tells the story of a young German volunteer named Paul. And Paul starts the war off being patriotic. He starts the war off believing in the nation, believing in the generals, believing in his teachers, their advice to him. But over the course of the war, Paul essentially is broken. There's a number of scenes that illustrate this point. But to my mind, probably the most powerful moment is when Paul is fighting this French soldier. They both basically went over the top. They wind up in a kind of shell crater, and they're fighting hand-to-hand combat. It's absolutely man on man. There's no advantage. And Paul ends up killing him by slitting his throat. But you don't necessarily die just from the initial slit. Sometimes it can take a little while. And so they're in the middle of a battle. There's all this, fighting going on, bullets, artillery shells, machine guns. And Paul is stuck in the shell crater watching this French guy die. After watching the Frenchman die, Paul begins to realize that they share a common humanity. He says at one point, this French soldier, that you're just a man like me. He even asks the dead soldier for his forgiveness. He winds up finding the soldier's picture of his wife or his girlfriend. He said, I'm going to write to her. I'm going to let her know that, you died a noble death. But the strain of combat, the strain of taking a life, if I can quote Clint Eastwood from the movie Unforgiven in 1992, when he's talking about this idea of death and killing, he says, it's a hell of a thing killing a man. You take all he's got and all he's ever going to have. For millions of veterans from World War I, the psychological consequences of combat are devastating. World War I, as we know, produced the first recognition of what we would now call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. At the time, it was referred to as shell shock in English. And during the first years of the war, before military authorities really understood it, they basically said, these soldiers that refuse to go back to their units, refuse to fight in battle again, that break down, they're cowards. They're deserters. And actually, they even execute some of these soldiers because they won't go back and fight again. Now, that's an extreme case, right? PTSD. But again, the psychological toll of the war on many who fought it was severe. Now, life behind the lines is actually not a whole lot better. As we know, World War I not only witnessed technical innovations such as poison gas in the airplane, but it also witnessed the recognition, at least, of the idea of the home front. This is the notion that civilians behind the lines actually play a pretty key part in the war effort. They contribute to it not through fighting, not through guns and bullets directly, but through their labor, through production, by maintaining morale. Now, during the Great War, German civilians were called on to make tremendous sacrifices in order to aid the war effort. In the initial phases of the war, this meant a variety of personal sacrifices, including things like volunteering, making patriotic donations to support the cause. You can hear stories in Germany of towns that literally took their church bells, melted down the church bells because it was needed for the war effort. By the end of 1915, the transition to a war economy and the effects of the British blockade led to the rationing of most basic goods. We're talking here about the rationing of things like potatoes, milk, bread, meat, butter. All of these are rationed by the end of 1915. Coal starts getting rationed 2 years later. We can also mention, just very briefly, that the war has a tremendous impact on labor relations. When the war begins, many industries suffer, as you might imagine. Many of their workers are called up. They have to go serve on the front lines. Others who had been involved in exporting, their markets dry up. It's always hard working in the tourist industry because tourism is very subject to global trends, global developments. We saw this during COVID, right? What was one of the first industries that really felt the weight of COVID? It was tourism because people couldn't go anywhere. Now, over the course of time, the demand for production of war material, the need to build things like shells, bullets, guns, uniforms, this actually increases the demand for labor at a time when a lot of your labor workforce has been sort of taken away. Workers now have to work longer hours, sometimes even for less pay, or even if they do get pay, what do you do with it, right? It's useless. We have the rationing of most things. And so whole industries had to reinvent themselves in order to meet the military's needs. In the Southwest, for example, the famous cuckoo clocks that you can see if you go to a place like Freiburg and Breslau, the clockmakers shifted production towards the making of timing fuses for artillery shells. We could spend several hours talking about what life looks like on the home front for Germans, but the point is that both on and behind the front lines, they had to make tremendous sacrifices on behalf of the nation, all with the understanding that it's going to lead to a brighter, victorious future in which their efforts would be recognized. By 1917, however, the lack of progress from all of the armies fighting led to a sharp decrease in morale. In Russia, of course, this would lead first to the overthrow of the Tsar in February, and then the provisional government the following October. The French army, too, would experience a series of large-scale mutinies in April and May of 1917. And while things never quite got this bad for the German army, under the surface, the strains of war began to sap faith in the country's traditional institutions and leaders. Soldiers and sailors began to question whether the sacrifices they made were worth the cost, reshaping perhaps at a subconscious level their understanding of what the nation was and how its politics were best decided. Should we follow those older authorities? Should we believe in the monarchy, in the church, in our professors that told us that this was going to be easy, glorious, and victorious? As the amount of sacrifices continue to increase and increase, as the weight of everything begins to weigh on soldiers like Hitler, who continued to serve in the war throughout the whole thing, the answer increasingly becomes no. Now, I'll say more about these transformations in just a moment, but before we get there, I want to finish the historical narrative for you because while the German armies did not break in the spring of 1917, one can argue that they kind of did at the close of the war the following October. And the results would be a shocking revolution and defeat that would accelerate this notion of the radicalization of German politics. Again, if we want to understand why anyone would want to support the Nazis, how anyone could be attracted to someone as crazy as Hitler, we have to begin by understanding how thoroughly discredited the traditional authorities and ideas were by the end of World War I. The story of the end of World War I in many ways actually starts with the Bolshevik Revolution and Lenin's realization that Russia needed to withdraw from the war. Now, the Bolshevik Revolution happens in October, November 1917, but it kind of continues on arguably for several years afterwards. Some historians would say really continues really into the 1930s. But the core part of the revolution, of trying to consolidate political power, that continued on into 1918. One of the things that Lenin does when he withdraws is he doesn't want to sign a peace treaty with Germany. He doesn't want to help them necessarily in their war effort. And so for a couple months, the Bolsheviks practice what they call neither war nor peace, until the Germans kind of get bored with it and say, fine, if you're not going to surrender, then the war is on and we're going to keep attacking. And so it's only in March 1918 that the Soviets will finally sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which grants massive concessions to the Germans. In addition to kind of pushing the front line increasingly back into the heart of what will become the Soviet Union, it also creates an independent Ukraine. And you might say, well, why did the Bolsheviks agree to such a bad treaty? And the answer is they didn't really care. That at some level they expected World War I to also create a Bolshevik-style revolution in Germany itself, and they figured once everybody's a socialist, once everybody's a communist, it doesn't really matter because we're going to get rid of these frontiers. We don't care about national destinies under communism. We care about class identities. Now, for the Germans, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and the withdrawal of Russia really presented a unique opportunity to try to win the war. Now, obviously, they wanted to win the war beforehand, but they knew that there was a kind of looming deadline, because basically once the United States decided to get involved in the war, the United States had millions of soldiers totally untested by the war, totally unperturbed by the amount of violence, the suffering. The American tolerance to fight in the war was a heck of a lot higher than anyone else's in Europe at the time. And so for the German General Staff, they say, look, we have this moment, 1918, we have to win the war in 1918 before the Americans show up. So under a plan conceived largely by Erich Ludendorff, the Germans therefore made their last major offensive, or series of offensives, in the spring and summer of 1918. Now, they don't just say, okay, now we've got numerical superiority, now we finally have the troops to deal the decisive blow and get the big breakthrough that we've been waiting for 4 years, but they also begin to develop new tactics. The Germans realized that this idea of let's have a super long artillery barrage, the artillery will destroy all the barbed wire, destroy all the machine guns, destroy all the fortifications. This tactic is actually really dumb or short-sighted. Because once you start lobbing all those shells in, once you start making a massive effort, you have now telegraphed to the enemy, this is where the big attack is about to happen. Also, if you are saturating a particular area with artillery shells, I will pull my troops out of that area until the bombardment is over. And so it actually isn't going to cause that many casualties. Another thing they figure out, which is pretty clever, is instead of trying to take the strongest points on the enemy's line, just go around it, bypass it, find the weak points, surround that enemy, and then eventually they'll probably surrender. Or you can attack them from behind, perhaps. When the Germans begin this series of offensives in the spring of 1918, they are initially incredibly successful. They begin to push the line back into France. They make advances that people hadn't seen since 1914. This contributes to this notion of a euphoria of expectant victory. We're going to win. It's going our way, finally. Unfortunately for the German Empire, however, this is still taking place in the 19-teens. Europe is still a semi-mechanized society. You have some cars. Of course, you start to see development of tanks, particularly on the Allied side. But a lot of the movements that are taking place are still basically horsebound. Right? If you want to have troops go somewhere, you can take them a certain way with the railroad. But in the end, they have to get off the railroad and march to whatever town they're going to fight at. If you want to get them ammunition, if you want to get them food supplies, you got to have horses and wagons to bring that to them. There isn't the fleet of cars and trucks that we would have in 1939, let's say. So even though they create these holes in the Entente lines, they can't really exploit them in the way that they would in later years. Another problem for the Germans is that the American soldiers show up, and the initial expectation is these Americans, they don't really have a lot of experience fighting. America is, it's a rising power, but they've not fought in real wars against like real armies like the French or the British or the Germans. They're not really going to offer strong resistance. But the first wave of American soldiers do fight tenaciously. In particular, if you're from a Marine family, you're familiar with the name of Belleau Wood. This is a battle fought in June 1918 when these early Marine Corps units basically are there, and they fight off and actually defeat the Germans, force them to retreat. By the time you get to early August 1918, Germans have gone from expecting to win the war, it looks like everything is going our way, to now we've lost the ability to conduct offensive operations. Over the course of the next 100 days, the British, French, and American forces would push the Germans back, breaking through the main German defense line, which was known as the Hindenburg Line, in late September 1918. Running short of supplies, with their morale broken by weeks of retreat, the German government asked for an armistice at the start of October, and this would take a couple weeks to iron out until obviously they would sign the armistice on November 11th, 1918. Now, before we move on, just think for a second about the psychological experience of 1918 in many Germans' minds. You fought this difficult war, you fought these hard battles, it was difficult, you've made all these sacrifices. It looks like it's paying off. It looks like we're winning. Finally, thank God. I'm so glad that we did all that stuff because now we're finally at the moment where we're going to get that expectant victory and all the glory that comes with it. And then, it all falls apart. In basically the span of 8 to 12 weeks, everything falls apart. Even the country is about to fall apart. And even the way I've just described it to you leaves out that the government propaganda wasn't telling the whole truth, right? They weren't saying, our armies are running short of supplies. Our offensives are bogging down, right? They continue painting things in a good light until all of a sudden at the very end, actually we're losing the war. When the war ends, the German army still occupies parts of France and Belgium. They have not been pushed back yet into Germany proper. They are not defeated in the same way that they had been in 1945. So again, there is this sense of psychological whiplash, right? How did this happen? How so quickly? It's almost like things just collapsed and imploded. It can't be that our armies were failing. It can't be that the heroic soldiers on the front were the ones that lost the war because they were winning. There must have been internal enemies, Jews, socialists, communists. They must have betrayed the fatherland. They must have killed it from the inside, or, of course, in the famous phrase, stabbed it in the back. Now, it was in this moment that the cracks, the doubts, the loss of faith in the Kaiser finally led to revolution. The backstory here actually concerns the German Navy, which, outside of the submarine fleet, actually didn't do a whole lot during World War I. They do fight a big battle at Jutland in 1916. It's basically kind of like a tie. The Germans actually do pretty well for themselves, but in the end, the German high command says, we don't want to lose our navy. We don't want to lose the sort of defense that they provide, allow the British to maybe stage like amphibious landings in Hamburg or in the north. So they basically spend the last 2 years of the war in port, not doing much of anything. As the war drew to a close in late October 1918, Admiral Reinhard Scheer ordered the fleet to engage the British in one last glorious battle. Now, why he wanted to do this? Think about it, the war is basically over. It's pretty meaningless. Why he wanted to do this is kind of an interesting question. It may have been an attempt to save the honor of the fleet, to say, well, okay, everybody fought in the war, but you just sat in port. That's not particularly honorable. That's not conversation many military officers would want to have. So let's go out, let's charge them one last time, just to win honor and glory for our unit. It may be that they had wanted to do this the whole time, and basically Hindenburg and Ludendorff had kind of prevented them from doing it. Maybe it was for strategic purposes. One of the things that the Allies demanded was that all the German submarines had to return to base. And so when the war is closing down, you now not only have your surface ships, but you also have submarines that can help them. We'll never know, of course, what the particular answer is, because the idea struck many of the sailors whose lives were at stake as complete madness. What do you mean the war is over? Why am I going to go risk my life in some sort of Pyrrhic charge where either we lose and I die, or maybe we win, but we don't really win anything. It doesn't really change anything. This idea that ordinary soldiers should just throw their lives away for the honor of their officers, my God, that's a horrible notion. And so when the sailors receive the order to sail, mutinies will take place on several ships. This starts on October 31st, and it will soon spread to the nearby town of Kiel, where on November 4th, tens of thousands of striking workers will join the mutinous sailors, and they basically just take over the town. Instead of listening to their officers or listening to the high command, they begin forming these workers' and soldiers' councils, which are known as Soviets. And this looks an awful lot like what happened in Russia, especially in February of 1917. Now, of course, as we know, a Bolshevik revolution did not follow. These local Soviets that are created by the workers' and soldiers' councils, they negotiate with leaders from the German Social Democratic Party, who was seen as kind of one of the more reform-oriented parties, not a party that really is loyal to the idea of monarchy. It's going to be pretty radical in the sense that it will lead to change. And so there is actually, surprisingly, a mostly peaceful transfer of power. As the revolt spreads to other cities and towns, reaching Berlin, for example, on November 9th, the Kaiser will finally decide to abdicate. And essentially what they do is transfer power to a Council of People's Deputies, which is a body that's not elected, but it's formed from this sort of uneasy alliance between the SPD, or again, the German Social Democratic Party, and the more radical USPD, which is the Independent Social Democratic Party. The USPD would eventually sort of split off. It's a bit of a complicated story that I'm going to simplify here, but basically the USPD essentially becomes the Communist Party in January of 1919. We'll talk more about the evolution of German politics in just a moment, but here I want to stop the narrative and make several critical analytical points. First, it's worth noting the speed with which the imperial government collapsed, something that was disorienting and that one could argue destroyed the idea of political normalcy. Looking back on the broader context 100 years later, the story obviously makes sense to us, especially as one looks at the collapse of similar governments and states in places like Russia, Austria-Hungary, and a little bit later the Ottoman Empire. But for contemporaries, they essentially went from feeling, as I said, like they were winning the war to having an entirely new system of government in the span of a couple weeks. In many ways, then, it is not surprising that this stab in the back myth spread so quickly in the German public. Now, the stab in the back myth, the idea that, okay, we lost a war that we were winning, it must be somebody else's fault other than the army, this is bad enough, but we're going to add to that the further sense of injustice caused by the Treaty of Versailles. Theoretically speaking, the Treaty of Versailles was to end a war. It was supposed to be negotiated. When people negotiate a treaty, even if the sides aren't completely equal, there's a bit of give and take. There's a bit of, well, this is what we think. This is what you think. Well, we'll give you a little bit here. Okay, we'll give up something there. But this is not what the peace process was like for the Germans. Instead, the Allies did a kind of pre-planning meeting, if you will. This was the idea that, well, we'll all get on the same page so we can negotiate as one with the defeated Central Powers. But instead, it kind of goes awry. They start fighting with each other until eventually they just draft the peace treaty and they hand it to the Germans in May of 1919 and say, here's the treaty, sign it, please. And the Germans obviously read through all of its provisions. They're very upset by it. They said, well, we're not going to sign this. This is ridiculous. We were winning the war. Okay, maybe in the end we lost the war, that's fine, but our armies were still on your territory when the war ended. Why on earth do we have to pay this draconian treaty with all the reparations payments, with responsibility for the war, with the loss of our colonies, with caps on the amount of soldiers we can have? For ordinary Germans, it's not a negotiation, it is what they call an imposed settlement or a diktat. And this dissonance between the German achievements on the battlefield, the locations of the battle line, as I said, at the time when the armistice is signed, but when you put that together with the nature of the Versailles Treaty, it seems incredibly unfair. And so again, this contributes to the notion that we are living in existential times. We trusted the old parties, we trusted the old authorities, the old institutions. Where did they take us? They took us to a disaster, a catastrophe. So again, if you want to understand where Nazis come from, how it's possible, you have to start with the idea that people believe the nation was facing or was undergoing an incredible crisis that demanded new forms of political organization and activism. And that is exactly what the Nazis became. We've actually already seen some of this search for a more radical form of politics through the formation of the German Soviets. These were intended to be a more direct form of democracy, the idea of replacing the power and authority of these imperial elites with the will of the ordinary person. And while for some, the soon-to-be communists Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, these raise hopes that there might be a Bolshevik-like revolution, we should also note that the more moderate socialists and their future political allies from the Catholic Center Party were also an expression of this post-war radicalism. The German Social Democratic Party before World War I are seen as the crazy people by a lot of quote-unquote normal Germans or mainstream Germans. The Catholic Center Party is supposed to represent the interests of the Catholic minority in Germany. They're important, but in Imperial Germany, they had kind of been on the outside. In the 1870s, they're actually, the reason the party comes into being is because Catholics are discriminated against. So at this moment when the new republic is being born, the republic itself is a sign of radicalism, is an expression of the desire for a new politics. After November 9th, the power of the old elites, the Prussian Jünger landowners, and the great industrial magnates were to be broken, replaced by a truly democratic government elected by universal suffrage. And when I say universal suffrage, I mean universal suffrage. This includes women. Women are going to vote in Germany for the first time. Now, of course, the communists and social democrats were not the only new game in town. And this brings me to my second point, which is that the experiences of war, defeat, and revolution created opportunities on the right to reimagine politics. With many of the older elites discredited, right? The arrogant Kaiser is the guy that had foolishly led the country into war. not this kind of mythic hero, this guy who ruled sort of by the grace of God or by history or providence, the man who's destined to lead Germans to a glorious future. No, he's kind of an idiot. The generals had mismanaged the war and thrown away an entire generation of patriotic youth. And so in these circumstances, the popular German right began to look for new leaders and symbols for inspiration. And here they would turn towards, or return, if you will, towards the idea of the front, to try to salvage what was best and most pure about the nation. We already saw this to some extent in our opening discussion of Hitler. The experience in the trenches, the ways in which mass sacrifice on behalf of the nation, and the feelings of camaraderie between soldiers, these seemed to Germans, both on the front, who had experienced the front, and those living behind it, it seems like something pure, like something true, something positive, something that is perhaps powerful enough to rescue the nation from its current plight in the early 1920s, late 19-teens. This movement did not necessarily begin with Hitler, although one could argue that he's a kind of part of it, right? As we'll see, Hitler's national or political awakening, despite what he writes in Mein Kampf, it actually comes in 1919, 1920, and he starts out kind of like a foot soldier. But Hitler is certainly a part or a reflection of this desire for new politics and to locate that new politics in the idea of the front and the combat and the soldier. These ideas are bigger, especially in the early 1920s, than just the early Nazi Party. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about these developments. And the place to start is not with the formation of political parties, but to try to understand the sentiments generated again by the experience of combat at the front. We mentioned a little bit earlier the reactions that many German soldiers like Remarque had to combat. Right? World War I leads to this explosion in pacifism. It leads to people that are literally broken psychologically, physically by the war. It leads to a lot of cynicism about the idea of war. Right? Why don't the French fight harder in 1940? Well, because a lot of them lived through 1918. A lot of them said, we don't want to fight. It's not worth it. And this type of reaction is obviously quite common in the years after World War I. But the experience of war also generates a second reaction, one that looks at the trench experience as something that is not destructive and debilitating, but they would argue it's actually empowering. The front experience refashions men into hard beings suitable of meeting the challenges of the time. We can see this in our politics today to some extent. If you went and talked to U.S. Navy SEALs or ex-U.S. Navy SEALs, they wouldn't say, man, the experience of combat, the SEAL training, that just made me not want to fight anymore. They would tell you that that experience gave them an advantage, gave them a kind of hardening, made them more attuned to the needs of the nation, more able to do the things that needed to be done to make the hard choices. And even though it's kind of hard for those of us who have never seen combat to understand that, if you think more closely about the experience of combat, it does kind of make a sort of sense. There is a kind of logic to it. Well, most of us, as I said, if we think about what would happen if I wound up in a military, what happened if I wound up in the middle of a fight, we'd be worried about getting killed. There is also an invigorating aspect to it. If I say you're about to put your life on the line, you're going to go over the top, you're going to go charge at the building with the terrorists or the crazy person that's holding up a school, in that moment, would you not experience a surge of adrenaline? Maybe you wouldn't describe that feeling of excitement as being something that's happy excitement. It's not like you're about to open a new present or something. But you would get this surge of adrenaline. Right? This is the moment. This is go time. All right, let's do it. This is depicted actually very well in Hollywood, right? You get these great battle scenes in movies like Braveheart, Civil War films. Someone kind of rallies the troops and then they scream and they run at each other and you get these big lines kind of colliding. If you're a soldier, if you're in that moment, if you're screaming, if death is on the line and this is your moment to either live or die, aren't you going to get a little bit of, again, adrenaline? Aren't you going to feel this kind of rush the moment comes? There is something that is, or that can be enlivening. One could argue about the idea of combat. Again, I mentioned Navy SEALs just a second ago. Think about people that are involved in MMA or boxing. Not even like professional boxing. Why do people do Muay Thai? Why do people do that? Why do foreigners come to Thailand? They want to box there? Because there is a feeling of adrenaline. It's not just about the audience, but it's about the moment, the rush. Another example, if you read literature written by ex-soccer hooligans or journalists who have covered soccer hooligans, or you just want to Google Ustavka on YouTube and go watch soccer hooligans fighting because they record it and they upload it. Why do they do all that stuff? Doesn't make much sense to me. But in the moment, in the heat of combat, in the rush, that adrenaline shot, there is a feeling of empowerment and excitement that can be very appealing. One can also add to this picture the moment after the combat ends. And I don't just mean this like, okay, so you're getting adrenaline. I think we've made that point clear. It's exciting. But what about when the battle's over? What about when you've gone over the top and the bullets have flied and, some of your friends are dead and the enemy are dead, but it's over? Don't you feel pretty good about having survived? Don't you think about later on in life, you say, okay, here's these challenges. I've got to give a big speech. There's going to be 100 people in the hall. Am I really going to feel nervous? Is there anything that can have bigger consequences or bigger stakes than me literally having someone shoot bullets at me and I survive it? I show the courage necessary to overcome the fear of death. Well, once I am not afraid of death anymore, then I'm not afraid of anything. And so for a subset of World War I veterans, even in the post-war literary production, one of the things that you notice is not just the themes expressed by people like Remarque or Henri Barbusse in France, but you get this alternate take that it produces this kind of superhuman experience, these superhuman men who are impervious to fear. And this brings me to a third quality some World War I veterans celebrated, which was the idea of companionship. If you are living under the circumstances I have described, with the stress of combat, with the difficult physical conditions, with, again, the shared risk of death, the exhilaration of victory, doesn't that kind of create these unique bonds of male affection that are really hard to reproduce artificially? Some of you know what I'm talking about because you've played on a sports team at some point, especially men. And going through the course of a season, going through the challenges that arise, whether that's in a particular game, whether that's dealing with outside forces, isn't there a kind of brotherhood that forms from the experience of being together and working together and experiencing these kind of, again, challenges? When I was an undergraduate at Syracuse University, I played rugby for a couple years till I got a couple concussions and I realized rugby's probably not for me. But we used to have these T-shirts that we would wear sometimes, and it has this very famous quote from Shakespeare, from Henry V. Many of you will be familiar with the quote. "For he today who sheds his blood with me shall be my brother." Right? There's no more perfect embodiment, at least in the English language, of this sentiment that the shared experience of death and sacrifice and trauma creates these kind of patterns of male bonding that, again, are impossible to create through other experiences. So for many Germans, after the war is over, after you're living in a society that is fractured by the war itself, fractured by the politics that come afterwards, whether you're talking about the left and right fighting each other, whether you're talking about the breakup inside of the left between basically the socialists and the communists, whether you're talking about all this fracturing, you say, how do I find something to build the nation on and put it back together? Doesn't this idea of a manhood, a fraternity, a sense of nationhood at the front, doesn't it seem true? Doesn't it seem tested and proven by the trials of war? Isn't it superior to the fake and flimsy or degenerated notions of loyalty that are talked about by people behind the lines on the home front, talked about by the politicians, the teachers, the professors, the preachers? Doesn't it just seem more true, more trustworthy? To put this another way, if you put yourself in the position of a German soldier during World War I, many of them felt a sense of betrayal by civic and civilian authorities outside of the army. Again, the politicians lied to you about the importance of sacrifice, while behind the lines, they're whining and dining themselves. The generals, as the British World War I song Hangin' on the Old Barbed Wire tells us, were pinning medals on their chest, safe behind the lines. I get the glory, but I didn't actually have to risk my life. Your teachers and preachers, again, I just mentioned that there's a famous scene from All Quiet on the Western Front where at the beginning, the professor, or basically he's like a high school teacher, he's telling all the boys, if you volunteer for Germany, it's going to be so glorious, it's going to be so easy. And that guy doesn't sacrifice anything during the war. He doesn't risk anything. And so again, if you get to the point where you say, what is real about the nation in these extenuating circumstances? The answer for many Germans is to turn back to the notion of the front experience and to use it or to look at it as the basis for a new and pure form of politics. Not to belabor the point, but a great illustration of this is a quote from a guy named Ernst von Salomon. Salomon was a young Freikorps member, which we'll talk about in a second, who wrote about this kind of moment right after the war. He's writing in the 1930s, but he's talking about basically 1919, 1920. Where was Germany? Salomon asked. Quote, in Weimar? In Berlin? At one time it was on the front, but the front collapsed. Then it was supposed to be in the homeland, but the homeland lied. It called in song and language, but the tone was false. One spoke of a fatherland and a motherland, but the Negro had that too. Where was Germany? Was it the people? But the people screamed for bread and shook their thick bellies. End quote. Later he concluded, quote, we were the border, meaning that he and his fellow veterans and the paramilitary formations they created were in essence the heart of the nation. Finally, we should just note that this process of national reconstruction was explicitly masculine. It was built on the notion that tough times require masculinity. One needs to be powerful to create political and social order, to protect one's family, and to ensure their economic well-being, to prevent crime and violence from being done to them. One needs to be emotionless and self-disciplined in order to carry out whatever actions are necessary, whether that involves personal sacrifice or using violence against others to ensure your own family's well-being. Being masculine can also mean to endure in difficult conditions, and to be physically, and to some extent even sexually vigorous. Were not all these qualities displayed by the frontline soldier during the war? The model of the new citizen needed to survive in the hard, apocalyptic almost post-war environment. Of course, the man whose writings are most often used to symbolize this newly emerging cult of masculinity in combat after World War I was the writer Ernst Jünger, whose memoir Storm of Steel became an international bestseller after its publication in 1920. Like Hitler, Jünger had been an early enthusiast for the war effort, volunteering shortly after the outbreak of hostilities in August 1914. Wounded several times, he served throughout the conflict and received multiple awards for bravery, including not only the Iron Cross First Class, but also the House Order of Hohenzollern and the Pour le Mérite, which is one of the highest awards that one can win in originally the Prussian army and then later the German army. Now, despite, or perhaps because of this extreme exposure to the violence of war, Jünger viewed the experience of combat as something that was exhilarating, that brought out the best in men. For example, while discussing the prospect of conducting night reconnaissance in no man's land in Storm of Steel, he noted that, quote, "These moments of nocturnal prowling leave an indelible impression. Eyes and ears are tensed to the maximum. The rustling approach of strange feet in the tall grass is an unutterably menacing thing. Your breath comes in shallow bursts. You have to force yourself to stifle any panting or wheezing. There is a little mechanical click as the safety catch of your pistol is taken off. The sounds cut straight through to your nerves. Your teeth are grinding on the fuse pin of the hand grenade. The encounter will be short and murderous. You tremble with two contradictory impulses, the heightened awareness of the huntsman and the terror of the quarry. You are a world to yourself, saturated with the appalling aura of the savage landscape." End quote. Now, if you read Storm of Steel, most of the book is actually a lot less dramatic than that. In fact, modern readers might find the memoirs from Vietnam or Iraq to be a little bit more graphic. You might be surprised at how dispassionately Jünger describes combat through the book. It's sort of PG, if you want to use sort of a modern rating system. One could argue that Jünger's War as Inner Experience from 1922 is a bit more dramatic, a bit more kind of passionate. But the key point here is again to highlight the way in which Jünger glorified the experience of combat for a younger generation of Germans who had lived through, but who were too young to actually serve in the war. We're talking here about men like future propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels, who was a student for most of the war. Heinrich Himmler was 13 when it began. Martin Bormann was only able to join in June of 1918. Hans Frank, another prominent Nazi tried at Nuremberg, joined in 1917 but never actually saw combat. Hans Frank was only 17 when he signed up. Ernst Kaltenbrunner, Baldur von Schirach, Albert Speer, the list goes on and on of these young men who, again, were old enough to understand the war, to perceive it, to read about it. When you're 13, you're aware of the world around you to some extent. You haven't necessarily personally experienced it, but there's a lot of things that you can imagine. There's a lot of things that you're aware of. These particular people felt a lot of passion. They saw the suffering, the sacrifice. They're like, we want to fight for the nation. We want to sacrifice for the nation. Here comes our chance. And then it just disappears because of the November Revolution and the armistice. Nazism, in many ways, one could argue, becomes a way to alternatively participate in World War I. It becomes a way to keep the struggle alive, to keep the challenge alive, to create or enhance or contribute to this masculinity that is born by the war. And again, as we'll see, it's not a coincidence that so many of these leading Nazis are people that psychologically understood World War I, but could not directly experience it because they were just a little too young to serve in the military. Now, the clearest political expression of the sentiment expressed by men like Hitler and Jünger that I've been talking about came from the newly formed Freikorps that sprang up in the aftermath of the armistice in November 1918. I don't know how much you guys know about the Freikorps. Basically, Freikorps means free company. The idea comes from the Napoleonic Wars. At a certain point in time, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe. He had forced the Prussians to ally with him. And so it was illegal for these kind of Prussian nationalists, if you want to call them that, these people, especially young people, students who didn't like Napoleon, who wanted to stand up for Germany, who wanted to fight in the war, but they can't just form an anti-Napoleonic kind of company. So they kind of tried to find ways around it, and eventually they would form these kind of free militias or volunteer militias that then would fight against Napoleon in 1813 and 1814. As the German army demobilized in 1919, a number of veterans organizations kind of spring up, and these become, several of them at least, become turned into modern-day militias, right? So they'll have uniforms, they'll have ranks, they'll get guns. And one of the things that drives their kind of creation is the emergency of the war, right? So the war ends, the armistice is implied, the German army has to demobilize. And so who is going to stand up and fight against a communist revolution, especially in those early days when the army is kind of disintegrating? The answer becomes these Freikorps militia units. One of the best known units, one of the largest units, was called the Stahlhelm, or the Steel Helmets. They were formed on November 13th, 1918, so just 4 days after the German Revolution. They're created by this factory owner and veteran named Franz Zelt. And the initial idea is basically, how are we going to support all these soldiers that are demobilizing? But the movement basically soon morphs into a reconstructed military unit, especially in early January 1919, when the newly formed Communist Party tries to seize power during something called the Spartacist Rebellion. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the Spartacist Rebellion here. Maybe I'll do a special podcast episode about it at a later date. But basically what happens is the relations between the kind of more moderate SPD and the more radical USPD break down in December of 1918. Part of this is big picture stuff. The USPD wants a kind of more Bolshevik-style revolution. They want a more radical revolution in terms of economics, in terms of property redistribution. The SPD wants a more moderate democratic revolution, right? We want to pass some laws. We want democracy. We want a social welfare system. But we don't want to start redistributing property. We don't want a red guard. We're not trying to get rid of the army. There's also some immediate factors that happen right around Christmas of 1918 that lead to this kind of breakup. But basically, on January 5th, the USPD calls for mass demonstrations in Berlin, and the newly born KPD, or Communist Party of Germany, will pour gasoline on the fire by calling for the overthrow of the SPD government. Since the official German army, again, is in a process of demobilization, the defense minister, who was a member of the SPD, a guy named Gustav Noske, he basically turns to these militia groups and says, can you please put down the communist revolution that is taking place in the city of Berlin? And these, again, very nationalist, very right-wing, hardcore guys, they look at this as an opportunity, as I said, to continue the war, to continue to act on behalf of the nation, and they pursue it with a kind of ruthless efficiency. In many ways, their crackdown is bloody and cruel. They will kidnap and murder the two leading figures in the KPD, a guy named Karl Liebknecht and a woman named Rosa Luxemburg. Rosa Luxemburg, very, very important to the history of communism in the 20th century, kind of an alternate to the kind of Leninist model. And the consequences for the communist cause are profound, right? On the one hand, it will deprive the party of its most effective leadership. Liebknecht and Luxemburg are both intellectuals. They are not working class people. Rosa Luxemburg, actually one of the first women to get a PhD in Europe. The other important consequence is it will drive a wedge between the communists, the KPD, and the SPD. Especially later on, once you get to the Depression, communists feel this sense of betrayal. Hey, we were supposed to be working together on behalf of the working classes. You got cozy with the bourgeoisie. You got cozy with the army, big business. What is going on? You have sold out the working man, they would argue. We'll talk more about that in a future episode. At any rate, by the mid-1920s, the Stahlhelm basically grows into an organization of over 300,000 members. It begins to have a strong political influence in addition to its military side of things. The Stahlhelm will be one of the leading voices denouncing the Treaty of Versailles, demanding a restoration of the German Empire. It will circulate rumors, such as the stab in the back myth. It will circulate rumors that Jews didn't serve in equal proportions during the war. In fact, they actually do a statistical study. Jews served in larger numbers during the war than their actual population in Germany. But nevertheless, these anti-Semitic stereotypes, they circulate, they become a convenient way to explain the sudden loss of the war. How could we lose this war? We were Germany, we were invincible. It can only be that we were betrayed from the inside, and those people who betrayed us must be outsiders themselves. Hence, we will argue that those are Jews. Another important Freikorps group was the Erhard Brigade, formed under the leadership of Captain Hermann Erhard on February 17, 1919. The immediate cause of their formation was the seizure of local army barracks by communist insurgents in Wilhelmshaven and Bremen which are two cities sort of in the north where the Navy was based. And again, because of the timing of things, the National Army can't get together, can't arm itself without the Allies going, oh, wait a minute, what's going on? Are you about to refight the war? And so basically, Erich is ordered to recruit what will become a private company that then can be used in local battles against these insurgents and then in other places around Germany. By April 1919, for example, they get sent down to Munich in Bavaria, and they will fight against the short-lived sort of council republic that gets set up in Bavaria. Now, the Erich Brigade never becomes as big or as politically powerful, if you will, as the Stahlhelm, but as we'll see in a second, they actually play a pretty critical role in German history. Before I continue with the sort of historical narrative, it's worth pointing out that these Freikorps units appeal to new members on a sociological basis, in addition to the sort of ideological sense, right? Why should you join the Freikorps? Well, because of nationalism, because of ideology, because we're going to create a new sense of politics. Okay, that obviously will attract a lot of people. But for those who had just missed the opportunity to fight during the Great War, they also offer, again, as I mentioned, this chance at heroic action, this possibility of taking symbolic action to defend the nation that you care about so much. Even for the less ideologically committed, they also offer a sense of order and discipline in a world beset by chaos. This is something that will also take place during the Great Depression. People don't have jobs, people don't have employment. What am I going to do all day? Joining a militia gives you a sense of purpose in your life, makes your life meaningful, makes it purpose-driven, to kind of twist Rick Warren's phrase. It gives you a sense of routine. We've got to drill. We've got to carry out these actions. We've got to march around. We've got to fight the communists or the fascists or the social democrats. Again, there are strong parallels here to hooligan groups, soccer hooligan groups, right? What is the attraction to it? It's not just, well, I'm frustrated and, I got laid off by Margaret Thatcher in 1979. That's not it. A lot of times it is the sense of it is giving my life a purpose. I'm not just out here doing things for myself, but my actions that I'm taking are on behalf of the greater whole. Finally, again, just to kind of wrap all this up, it allows me to live or relive the story of the Great War without making defeat the last chapter in the book. The story of Germany, the story of this violent period we're living through, it doesn't end with the armistice in November 1918. It's going to continue. We get to keep fighting. We get to have new enemies. And so basically within these groups, a new ideological and sociological space opens that will celebrate the nation. Not through its political institutions, not through its legal precepts, not through the idea of the nation is a community of equal individuals, of citizens. These Freikorps will offer an explanation for German defeat that is not the fault of Germans, or perhaps the right Germans. They will offer a vision for restoring national politics that claims to be outside or above politics. You can be cynical about the idea of traditional politics, about all the parties. You can say, those politicians, I hate them. They're all losers. But by being in my Freikorps, I can still be political. I can still have a political voice and want to influence the overall political process without attaching myself to those parties and institutions that were corrupted by the war. And all of this is going on, by the way, in a culture that not only has experienced violence, but that celebrates violence. Not just as, okay, there's the trope about the sheriff, especially if you watch movies from the 50s, the lawman's coming to town, in those Westerns, he's going to put those outlaws in their places. We in even modern American society, we like the idea, to some extent, of the lawman, right? We got to use violence. We got to be tough sometimes. We got to enforce the rules. We got to knock some heads together. These people in the Freikorps units go further than that. They say violence is in some ways a sort of ritual. It is a means of asserting or performing or reinforcing the power dynamics between groups. It is a way for us to show that we, the Freikorps people, are the ones with power in societies. You workers that are, attracted to communism, you workers that are attracted to social democracy, you guys can have your rallies, you can do your strikes, but in the end, you're not really the ones with the power. We are the ones with the power. When these Freikorps units, as I said, when they crack down on working class movements, when they crack down on these sort of communist rebellions that pop up in various places and contexts, they will use excessive amounts of violence to deal with them. When Freikorps units reoccupy Munich, for example, in April and May of 1919, they sentence over 2,000 workers either to death or to long-term prison sentences, basically for having supported this kind of short-lived workers' council. We also talked, of course, about the way they murder Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Now, at the same time, despite the organization's nominal purpose of defending the new Weimar state, beneath the surface, these Freikorps units, as we've kind of hinted at, are not loyal to the state itself. They want a return of the monarchy. They want some kind of centralized, authoritative dictatorship. That's what's going to provide order in society. That's what's going to fix the problems created by all the breakdown of World War I. When Weimar authorities are a little bit stronger, right, the immediate moment of the armistice has passed, the German army has been sort of demobilized and rebuilt. When Weimar authorities try to assert more direct control over these Freikorps units, first in the summer of 1919 in places like Latvia, or later in the spring of 1920 in Germany itself, they rise in open revolt against the government. There are a couple examples of this, but the one that is most important for our story is known as the Kapp putsch, which takes place in March of 1920. The backstory to the Kapp putsch is very simple. Basically, the defense minister, as we mentioned, from the SPD, Gustav Noske, he's getting to a place in time when the Versailles Treaty has been sort of approved. They've got to reduce the German army from about 350,000 soldiers to 100,000 soldiers. And so getting rid of these kind of inconvenient sort of loose cannon Freikorps, that seems like a good idea to him. On February 29th, Noske ordered the Erich Brigade to disband. But Erich didn't think of himself as a loyal soldier in a chain of command in which the civilian leadership is ultimately the expression of the will of the nation. Friedrich Ebert is the guy that I should be listening to. In the American parlance, he's the commander-in-chief. Instead, Erich says, no, I'm here for Germany. I'm not going to take that order. In fact, I'm going to have a parade on the streets of Berlin to show you how I'm not disbanding. Things degenerate quickly. Erich's nominal commander was a guy named General Walter von Lüttwitz. Lüttwitz is supposed to fire Erich, is supposed to help break up this band, but Lüttwitz says, no, I support the paramilitary group. In fact, when Ebert tries to go and fire him, Lüttwitz meets with him and says, actually, I've got some demands of my own. I want the National Assembly disbanded. I want new elections. I want myself to be placed in supreme command of the army, altruistically. Now, of course, Ebert refuses to do this, and so Lüttwitz asks Erich to occupy the capital. Lüttwitz also begins organizing additional sort of sympathetic conspirators. He reaches out to our old friend Erich von Ludendorff. Ludendorff, of course, had been Hindenburg's chief of staff during World War I, had been one of the main architects of German strategy. And so Ludendorff actually comes in. Actually, Adolf Hitler he's not a big figure at this point, but he will actually fly to Berlin as well during the Kapp putsch. He actually lands at the airfield when it's occupied by socialists. And so he kind of pretends not to be Hitler and he kind of gets away. It's one of those moments where what if history had just taken a little kind of turn, might have been very different. On the morning of March 13th, Erich's men move into the capital and meet little armed resistance. Now, the German army did exist at this point, but their top commanders told them, don't shoot at these Freikorps units. The Freikorps units are German soldiers. They are literally veterans from World War I. We're veterans from World War I. We're German army soldiers. We don't shoot each other. So who's left to defend the Social Democratic Party? Who's left to defend the actual Weimar government? The most radical workers, the ones who would have wanted to form something like a Red Army or a Red Guard, they were killed during the Spartacist rebellion. They don't feel a sense of loyalty to you. And so the putsch is actually initially very successful. The members of the SPD government will flee. Wolfgang Kapp, a 62-year-old civil servant and member of the right-wing German National People's Party, or the DNVP, is named the new chancellor, and Lüttwitz does take control of the army. And as all this takes place, most of the senior army officers either just kind of sit there and say, okay, we're just going to sit on the sidelines, we'll see who wins, and then we'll join the winning side. Or worse, they say, oh, we wanted these guys to come back into power. We wanted the army to be in power. We wanted some sort of right-leaning or conservative, dictatorial or authoritarian state. Maybe we can bring back the monarchy. Maybe, this revolution happened in 1918. Maybe we can just erase it. Maybe it was just a blip in history. And so for many observers, it seems like this coup has been successful. However, there are some key distinctions between what Kapp tried to pull off and Lüttwitz tried to pull off and what Hitler would eventually pull off in 1933. One of the biggest distinctions is the naked brutality of the coup. If you are someone who thinks of yourself as a supporter of the Weimar Republic, if you are one of those middle-class families, if you are one of those SPD-supporting working-class families, if you're a Catholic, it's really easy to rise against this kind of threat because it is so extra-legal, because it is so obviously illegitimate. And so on the day that Erhard's men occupied Berlin, a general strike is called for, and it will eventually be supported by over 12 million Germans. That is about a fifth of the country's population. This isn't just a strike with guys on the picket line, yelling with slogans, hey, hey, ho, ho, so-and-so has got to go. We are talking about a complete shutdown of the capital and other cities as well. Who is making the electrical utilities work if all of the workers go on strike? How are goods and services circulating around the capital if all of the transportation is on strike? If all the telephone operators go on strike, how are we talking to one another? What if all the factories are closed? After just 4 days of paralysis, the Kapp government opens negotiations on a surrender, and essentially this is what they would do. Now, Ebert's government, one could argue, also makes a number of really critical mistakes in this period. One of the things that they do is they offer new elections as part of the deal, and they actually offer amnesty for most of the people involved in the coup. Now, Kapp and Lüttwitz had to resign, but they weren't initially arrested. They weren't initially tried for treason. They were allowed to go abroad. Kapp would finally return in Germany in April 1922, where he was arrested, but he never actually stood trial because he died while in custody. Lüttwitz would flee abroad to Hungary. He's able to return to Germany in August 1925 after a general amnesty is declared. And he actually dies in 1942 without really participating in politics or really having any kind of major political role. In addition, like Lüttwitz, many of the lower individuals who participate in the putsch, they don't get arrested, they don't get punished. After May 1920, most of them are allowed to join the regular army. One of the people who does pay a kind of political price for this is actually Defense Minister Noske, who had overseen the whole fiasco, and basically as part of the agreement to end this strike, the strikers don't just say, oh, okay, SPD, we're for you, come on back. They say, look, this SPD guy, Noske, he was too lenient on these Freikorps guys for many years. They say, okay, we'll get rid of him, we'll replace him with someone else. Who should we put in charge of the army? Well, why not a general? Why not a guy named Hans von Zieck? Von Zieck, by the way, was, incidentally, the man who had ordered his soldiers not to fire on the putschists in the beginning. He was someone who did not feel a strong sense of loyalty to democracy, to the Social Democratic Party, or its allies, or its basic ideals and values. So needless to say, this kind of lenient attitude adopted by Weimar authorities towards the people who were openly hostile to its very existence, this is going to prove to be a major problem. By not forcing or requiring the loyalty of people in the democratic state, and in particular of military officers, they provided space where right-wing movements could plot the future overthrow of the Republic, and that is exactly what they're going to do in 1930. Now you'll notice I didn't say 1933. We're going to get into that later in the podcast. Hitler comes to power in 1933, but one could argue that in many ways the Weimar Republic was already dead. It had already been stabbed. It was bleeding out, whatever metaphor you want to use. Equally importantly, while the pro-Weimar parties retained their electoral plurality, those who were opposed to the Weimar state gained considerably. The SPD, for example, which was the bedrock number one party associated with the Weimar Republic, you can maybe argue the Center Party was as well, the SPD lost 16% of its vote share and 62 seats in the Reichstag with those elections that followed. Where did those votes go? They went to the communist-friendly USPD, who gained 61 out of the 62 seats that were lost. The classic liberal German People's Party, their vote share fell from a very solid 18.6, right? This is a multi-party election, so you don't really have just like the two parties like we have here in the United States. They lose almost 10%, going down to 8.3%. The Catholic Center Party loses about 6% of the overall vote share. Where do these votes go? Many of them go towards more right-wing parties, such as the aforementioned DNVP, which gains about 5%, or the less radical DVP, which gains about 10%. And again, this is 10% of the overall vote share. The consequences of the Kapp putsch can sometimes be lost in modern histories. It often gets reduced to being a kind of couple paragraphs here and there. Oh, by the way, this was the right-wing violence. The left-wing violence was Spartacism. They kind of cancel each other out. I've mentioned before Richard Evans, who wrote this sort of magisterial trilogy on the history of the Third Reich. It was very impressive, very lengthy. It's 460 pages of the first book, which is called The Coming of the Third Reich. How much of it is devoted to the Kapp putsch? About 3 paragraphs. Nevertheless, I would argue that the Kapp putsch actually contains many important lessons for our understanding of the environment in which the Nazi Party was born. First, in part, it sort of showcases this idea of a reorganization of political authority and nationalism. Members of these right-wing Freikorps in the immediate aftermath of World War I reform or change or shift or modify, whatever words you want to use, but their sense of what it means to be a part of the national community and how one is loyal to the national community changes in very direct and very important ways. They are not thinking of disloyalty to the state, disloyalty to the president, that he have not following orders. They're not thinking of that as treason. They don't care what Ebert has to say anymore, to some extent. Their allegiance is to this more abstract ideal of the nation, which is represented by, again, these kind of right-wing groups. It's represented by the front soldiers. It's represented by a different community than the inhabitants or the citizenry of this legal state of Germany. All of that is kind of a superstructure, one could argue, for them. But underneath is what's more important, the real kind of idea of a folkish nation, a nation bound together by blood, by experience, by politics in terms of ideology. And this was pretty important to the story of how we get to National Socialism, because that is exactly what the Nazis do. They reimagine the body of the German nation. Second major consequence that I would highlight is the legitimation of the use of violence. Before 1918, when we think about how do we solve political problems, how do we think about what should the tax rate be? Should we have social welfare programs? What about, in the modern day, think about something like abortion. How do we decide the abortion question? We'd say, okay, we vote, we have pressure campaigns, we raise awareness, fundraising, social media, electoral office. The idea that we should just solve them by imposing our will through violence seems to us to be illegitimate, or hopefully it seems to us to be illegitimate. For these Germans in the wake of 1918, for these guys in the Freikorps in particular, violence becomes not just something that we might have to rely on one day, but it becomes the preferred tool to solving social problems. And we will see this in spades when we talk about the Nazi state. Once the Nazis are in power, violence is how we take care of business. Just a final thing I would add about the Kapp putsch is, as I've already mentioned, there seems to be this profound lack of consequences for disloyalty. Now, you have people like Ludendorff who were not going to be loyal to democracy no matter what you made him do or what you made him say. But there are others that paid no price for being part of these revolutionary movements. And so if it's not going to cost me anything, then why should I care? Why shouldn't I do it? Where's the dissuasion? If you're not going to punish people for violating laws, why should they believe in the sanctity of law? This was a problem not just for the early days of the Weimar Republic, but it would be a problem that would plague them all the way through until the days of the destruction of the Republic. There is no consequence for disloyalty for those groups that wanted to destroy democracy. And in a weird way, this actually works doubly against people who believed in it because when the Nazis assumed power legally, it's hard for people in the SPD, or even to some extent the KPD or the Center Party, to resist Hitler because he's doing everything legally. We still feel that sense of loyalty to the state, to the institution, to the office. I want to end with one last major thought about this period, which is again to emphasize how persistently violent it was. We left off our historical narrative talking about the 1920 Kapp putsch, but it was hardly the end of all this violence. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this because we simply don't have time, but there are other risings that happen in March 1920. We have right-wing groups that will basically, and some of them are kind of the direct descendants of the Freikorps. So the Freikorps get disbanded. What are we going to do? Well, we'll start carrying out assassinations. We'll form secret organizations to, again, use violence to impose our will and to continue fighting on behalf of the nation. Two of the big names that are often cited at this moment of assassination in the early days of the Republic are Matthias Erzberger. Erzberger was a Catholic who had signed the armistice in August of 1921. Just to be clear, Erzberger is assassinated in August of 1921. He signed the armistice on November 11th, 1918. The other name, of course, is Walter Rathenau. Rathenau was Weimar's Jewish foreign minister in June of 1922. Again, June of 1922 is when he's assassinated. And of course, as many of you know, in November 1923, Adolf Hitler would famously launch his own rising known as the Beer Hall Putsch. So far, I've been talking mostly about right-wing risings. There's also a number of left-wing risings that happen as well. You also have outside of Germany a considerable amount of violence between 1919 and 1923. We have violence in Poland, in Hungary, in the Baltics, in Ukraine, in Russia. And all of these episodes, if you put them together, help convince ordinary Germans that they're living through extraordinary times. To put this more directly, all this violence brutalizes their notion of politics. It makes them increasingly convinced that the old ways of doing things are just unable to rise to the challenges of the day. That to have a future, the nation's political leaders had to abandon the restraints and the traditional practices of the past. The new leaders for the future Germany needed to be tough. They needed to be masculine. And increasingly, they needed to be willing to use violence to secure the national destiny. Who exactly those leaders were going to be was still something that needed to be worked out. While it's tempting and oftentimes typical to tell the story of Nazi Germany as if it's this sort of inevitable march of victory of Hitler and the Nazis over democracy, the reality is that Hitler was one of many options in the early 20s who might have served such a purpose, giving political form to the desire, as we've talked about, for a conservative, authoritarian state. In many ways, it was as if someone had spread a bag of rotten seeds across the German political landscape, and each one tried to grow in the fertile Weimar soil. But as anyone with gardening experience will tell you, not all seeds make it to maturity. Some get stepped on, some never germinate because they're simply too weak. Others blossom quickly, but then get cut down, they're killed by frost because they emerge too early, or even consider a large plant grows and then it gets eaten by an animal because it's a large plant and the animal sees it. In many ways, one could argue Nazism was just one of many right-wing alternatives available to Germans in the early 1920s. But the moment was not yet ripe for the overthrow of the new democratic government. In the early 1920s, large segments of the German public were still willing to give democracy a chance. They still saw democracy as one of these kind of radical alternatives to the traditional politics of a constitutional monarchy. The rift between the left-wing SPD and the far-left KPD was there. It was certainly growing, but it had not yet become a chasm that prevented the two from working together against their common enemies on the right. Mention, a lot of KPD people are arrested or killed during the Spartacist rebellion. They feel betrayed by the social democratic leadership. And yet when the moment comes and the Kapp putsch happens in 1920 and there's calls for a general strike, they don't say, well, screw the SPD, screw the Weimar government. We'll take our chances with the fascists. They rally to the cause, they participate in the strikes, and they help defeat the Kapp putsch. Moreover, as the geopolitical and economic situation stabilizes after 1923, the rationale for radical change increasingly diminishes. And these factors can be used as a compelling argument for the early success of the Weimar Republic. But unfortunately, the political revolutions in nationalist politics that were, as we talked about, kind of happening a little bit below the surface, they were there, they were kind of obvious if you looked at them. But the leaders of the Weimar Republic kind of said, well, giving us your tolerance, allowing us to kind of exist in these positions, not trying to actively work against us, we'll take that. We're not going to make you or force you to really adopt these new ideals of the nation or to adopt this idea of the nation as a community of citizens, as a Bevölkerung. We're not going to push that on you. They never dealt with this, and it would obviously come back to hurt them in fatal ways. Right-wing groups and institutions like the army, like the Freikorps, like the political parties that kind of supported them or were associated with them, they learned after 1923 to at least tolerate the Republic. But they did not love it, and they were certainly not loyal to it. They would bide their time waiting until the right moment to move towards an authoritarian system. And that moment would come in 1929 with the onset of the Great Depression. But that's something that we'll discuss in a future episode. Before we get to 1929, we need to focus more clearly on the Nazi seed, to understand how the party was born, how it germinated, why people found Hitler so appealing. And then we'll also talk about how it almost all disappeared by the middle of the decade. As we talked about, Hitler does try to overthrow the Bavarian government in November 1923. It doesn't work out. He lost. He winds up in prison. So how does he do all these things and why does he survive? These are going to be a subject of our next episode when we look at the birth and the rise, if you will, of the Nazi Party. That's going to be it for now. If you've enjoyed this episode or found it useful, please recommend it to your friends, either through social media or by rating us on Spotify or iTunes. We really appreciate that. Everything with these podcasts, it's all about getting in the algorithm, and the more engagement you have, the more people recommend it, the more people give it like 5-star ratings, the more people will see it when they search for something like History of Nazism. You can also check out our website, www.historyoffthepage.com, which, as I mentioned at the beginning, has additional episodes and reading recommendations. And you can also find some of those special episodes, like The Young Hitler, on Patreon starting in late April. At any rate, thanks again for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time as we take history off the page.